Good afternoon. I'm Mary Reese from NJPSA and FEA. Several years ago, we met folks from the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital Access. We were very pleased that they joined us for our Arts Integration Summer Institute and have for the past several years. So Ashley Naranjo, who is the manager of education engagement, suggested that perhaps we might want to consider a webinar series with some of the museums within the Smithsonian Center. So we have had two already, and this is our third with the National Air and Space Museum. So we're really excited that we have our Smithsonian experts with us today, and I'd like to turn it over to Ashley. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thanks so much, Mary, and we are so excited to be here today. Thanks for joining us. Today, we're going to talk about how we see the sun, and my two colleagues, I'm joined by Ann Caspari and Becca Ljungren. Do you guys want to both introduce yourselves real quick?
Yeah, hi, I'm Ann Caspari, and I am early childhood education specialist at the National Air and Space Museum. I do programming for young children, whether they come with school groups or with their families, and then professional development for teachers at the museum.
And I'm Becca Ljungren, and I'm the Astronomy Education Program Coordinator here at the Air and Space Museum. So the topic of the sun is something I talk about with visitors of all ages all the time. We have a public observatory where we get to view the sun and times when we're able to be together and outside. And we also create a lot of digital content, teacher professional development, all across the board, all to do with astronomy education.
Thank you both so much for joining us today. My name is Ashley Naranjo, and I am from the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital Access. We are the office that manages the Smithsonian Learning Lab for the entire Smithsonian Institution, which includes 19 museums, 9 research centers, and the National Zoo. Within this series, you also met educators from the National Museum of the African American History and Culture, as well as the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And they were looking at arts integration, for example, art and history and art and English language arts. And today with the National Air and Space Museum, we're going to look at art and science connections too. If you're tweeting about your teaching experiences, our organizations are both on Twitter and have been using at Smithsonian Lab and at Air and Space to share lots of distance learning resources with teachers, with caregivers, and with learners. So feel free to ask for some advice or retweet us if there's a resource that you like that we've been sharing, but that's the way to stay connected with us through Twitter. And so one of the things that we've been talking about throughout this series is the Smithsonian Learning Lab. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a free platform. It's a digital platform that actually allows you to have access to over 5 million digital resources from across the Smithsonian. You can then create kind of personalized collections or find collections that have been created by museum educators like the three of us. And then you can also share out what you've created online so that it's searchable for other teachers to find. So today in this session, we're going to talk about one specific collection, but know that there are over 6,000 different collections that have been created by museum educators and teachers across the country. And so we'll look a little bit deeper at what those might entail. I want to say too, you'll see on the screen, it says everything under the sun, and that was not a pun that was intended for this webinar specifically. We always have sun imagery up there, but it really is true. You know, the Smithsonian offers resources across history, art, culture, and science, and it offers resources from pre-K all the way to lifelong learners in a variety of different formats too. And so what you'll find in the Smithsonian Learning Lab are specific individual resources. And when I say resources, I mean things like digital images, texts, which could be blog posts, but they could also be field journals or letters, diaries, videos with Smithsonian experts, audio recordings, podcasts, websites, lesson plans, and even instructional strategies as well. And once you find those resources, you can actually aggregate them into collections, and they can be a group of your favorite items, or they could be a little bit more complex, like a complete lesson plan aligned to standards too. So each resource includes a few elements of interactivity once you have an account. And I will say, to create an account, it's free. And basically it adds a level of personalization or customization that you can start to bookmark things within the Learning Lab and start to create your own collections as well. If you want to just view a collection or view some of the resources from the Smithsonian, you don't need a Learning Lab account. Each collection page also includes the title of the collection author, and a short description, as well as some really highly visual resources too. So you can see in this example on the screen, they're looking at environmental stewardship through art. There's lots of bird imagery from across the Smithsonian. So just to kind of get us oriented with what the Smithsonian Learning Lab is, what a resource is, and what a collection is, I wanted to start there. So with that, we're going to take a look at how we see the sun. And so I'm going to turn it over to Becca and Anne.
All right. Welcome again, everybody, to How We See the Sun. So both of us are educators, and I know we introduced ourselves previously, but we wanted to give you a little more insight about the way that we talk about science, art, and history in both of our specific contexts. So in the picture you see below, you can see the observatory I mentioned. I work a lot with technical and scientific equipment with the public, and so a lot of what I do is grounded in science and science history. But that doesn't preclude us exploring how art connects and really actually enhances our understanding of the natural world. And so we'll often do a lot of joint projects, thinking about the music that is connected to the things that we're observing, a lot of drawings and artworks created by it, as well as kind of honoring the inspiration that is created by viewing celestial.
Becca, I might be having a little bit of trouble hearing you just now. Anne, are you having the same issue too? Okay.
Yes.
There we go. So I
How
hear
about
Anne,
now?
and now I hear you back there. Yeah, perfect.
All right, sorry about that. My
No
phone
worries.
fell off of my desk and onto my mute button. So yay, technology. But I was just talking about how we love the inspiration that the natural world inspires in the arts and vice versa. And that's kind of where we are in our astronomy education programming.
Yeah, and I do early childhood programming. So I do programming for preschool audiences and then all the way up to like second grade about. In the picture there, you can see me. Typically, we read stories in the museum galleries and connect those stories to objects in the museum. Maybe it would be a glider, or it could be one of the scientific equipment that measures the sun or looks at the sun. Any kind of number of things, and then we connect those stories to the history and the science and the art in the museum. And then oftentimes with the children, I do a lot of close looking with the objects in the museum, kind of direct their view to those objects and, have a conversation about them in ways that can connect to their lives. And then often make objects. Maybe it'll be a model or a play object that they can use to take back to the classroom or home with them, so they can continue to think about and play with the ideas that we introduced in the museum.
So we can go, look at I think the Learning Lab is next. So to frame the conversation today, with Learning Labs, we actually created a collection that you'll have access to and that anybody can have access to, all about how we see the sun, both in science and in art. So we can show you a little bit about what that looks like. And we created this collection with a lot of different resources pulled from across the Smithsonian. And our intention is to not recommend that you explore every single resource during one whole session, but use all these different potential resources as a springboard for the conversations that we're actually going to discuss and model later on in this webinar. So there's a lot of really fun stuff in there. It was a lot of fun to put together. So we actually picked a few specific resources that we want to go over with you and highlight throughout the rest of our time together.
And this is just a smattering of sun objects that the Smithsonian has. There's many, many more sun objects. So we had to kind of create this collection and then cull it a little bit, but leave a pretty big breadth of the objects so that you can have things that speak to you and that you think you would like to use as a resource in the collection.
Perfect. And just for everybody who's kind of following along at home, this resource is available to you right now for free. You know, you can use it as soon as you leave this webinar. The great thing about the Learning Lab is you can also make a copy of this collection. You can pick and choose what works for you. You can add additional sun images in there too. So it's available through the Learning Lab. If you search How We See the Sun, you'll find it. And we can also add it in the chat box for you as well. But I just wanted to kind of give folks a little bit of framework as far as kind of what we're looking at and that sort of thing. So we're going to go back to the slides. Excuse me. And just give me a second as I get everything squared away for us. All right.
Great. So we're going to think a little bit about close looking in science and art. Close looking is something that we really like to do in the museum field, really thinking about how to develop those skills of just really looking at things and then thinking about what we're seeing and going further with those ideas. So this is one of our favorite thinking routines that we like to use. And these thinking routines were put together by Project Zero. But they are really great ways to frame conversations around artworks and also any kind of objects, science objects as well. Did you have anything to add to that, Rebecca?
And one nice resource that you can explore is this thinking routine and others, both on Project Zero's website as well as on Learning Lab. There's been a lot of great work done through different collections. And so we're just highlighting one such way that we use these thinking routines to explore different topics or objects. But there are so many more that you can use and you might already be familiar with. And also, if you are familiar with other thinking strategies that you have used, put them in the chat box. We'd love to hear about them.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I love about this routine, and we can kind of switch back and forth between teacher hats and learner hats throughout this session. But one of the things I really love about it is that they're seemingly simple. So, you know, obviously, what do you see? What do you think about that? What does it make you wonder? But what I love about this is it starts to open up ideas about observation. It really kind of opens up for everyone. Just what are you seeing in this image? And then when you think about what do you think about, there's a little bit more of interpretation. And then it kind of evolves into a conversation about curiosity. So I just wanted to point out those things as we're going through the routine with Becca and Anne to kind of be looking both as a learner for a little while, but then also kind of at the end, I would love to debrief a little bit as kind of your educator hat as well.
Definitely. And one thing that's really, one thing that's really important to us, just one more point about close looking. Thank you for driving, Ashley. I really appreciate it. Is that as museum educators, we're often not in structured environments with classes that we're working with for many months at a time and get to know very closely. And so we often make a lot of different modifications to engage our different audiences. And we want you to know that these kinds of strategies you can modify to work within your environments as well. So we're going to probably talk about these strategies in a few different ways, both at putting ourselves in the learner's position as well as educators to see how you can also modify this kind of work. So we're going to actually model now of using this strategy to explore science and art images and make connections between them and bigger ideas. And next slide, Ashley. I always want to mention there are standards that we have associated with this in terms of national art standards as well as next generation science standards. These are also listed in the Learning Lab collection that we created. But I just wanted to let you know that this is something we definitely are thinking about all the time in creating these kinds of experiences. So as part of these experiences, and Anne will tell you a little bit more, one thing that's really important to us is being able to give students or participants a chance to interact as part of their learning process. And I know that you probably enjoy doing that in your classroom yourself. And so we created a framework for an activity that could be done with an exploration of how we see the sun. And Anne can kind of take you through what that might look like. Oh, we can go back to the slide about
Great.
the
So
activity.
hopefully
I
my
know Anne is
internet and
having,
the
I
this is
know,
having a
I'm
little.
sorry. So I can explain a little bit more about the activity, and Anne, if you want to jump in, please feel free. With an activity surrounding close looking, often we want to start where the participant is coming from. See what they might know about something first before we tell them or ask them to look at something else. And so the question that we would ask in this case would be, what does the sun look like? And maybe have them create either a model or an art project based on what their knowledge base is. And this is something that they could potentially come back to later on during one session or other sessions involving this kind of close looking. And we'll model what that might look like in a little bit. When they are creating activities like this, it's great to ask questions about the choices that they made, asking things like, what did you notice about your version of the sun? Why did you make that decision? This will help them think about the process of thinking about their version, as well as highlight things they might not have noticed or they intrinsically just kind of put down. Anne, was there anything you wanted to add?
Oh, can you hear me? Can you see me and hear me
We
now?
can, we totally can.
Yay. I'm back. Yeah, just I had a hard time hearing what you said, Becca. I'm sorry, but I think probably um just drawing is a great way for young children also to think. So they can, it's a good way to express your ideas if you're not as verbal. So that's another thing that's great about drawing is that it can be art, but it also can be another a way of expressing ideas.
Absolutely. So now we're going to go through and put our learner hats on, take our educators hats off, which we can't really ever do because it's always in the back of our mind. And I'd like to start with thinking about close looking and the sun itself using a science image. So what I'm probably going to do is I'm going to lead Anne and Ashley through looking at this image, and I'm going to ask a few questions, and please feel free to answer them in the chat as well. And when I see them pop up in the chat, I'll try to say them out loud as well. So when we're looking at an image or an object, we want to take a moment to look at it first before we do anything else. So I'm just going to give everybody a moment to just look silently and closely at what this image is on the screen. In a busy museum, this doesn't feel as awkward. There's always sound and stuff. I know it can feel like a long time of looking, but often with images and objects, especially if you're looking at art objects in a different context or science objects in a different context than normal, taking time to look at these first before delving into them can allow people to establish a more comfortable footing in engaging with them. For science images, we notice this kind of frustration all the time. So we often give people a chance to really look before we do any kind of questioning. So now that I've given everybody a moment to look closely at this image, I'd like to ask Anne and Ashley, and for those of you in the chat, what do you see in this image? What do you notice? And when I say what do you see, what do you notice, I'm speaking about the things that are in the image itself. So we're going to keep our inferences or our ideas about what those things might mean for a little bit of analysis later on. So what do you see when you're looking at this image?
I can, oh, I can start if you'd like.
It's
I
round.
have an idea.
Oh, it's
Um,
round is what Anne said. Her voice came through. And Ashley, go ahead.
Perfect. Yeah, no, that's a great. So it's round. The other thing that came to mind too is there's kind of a glow or a lighter shade around the entire circle that I'm looking at.
That is such a great thing to notice. It might get lost at first. It's a very fine detail. What else do you notice?
I think in the chat too, we
There
have,
seems like there's a texture.
Ooh, a texture maybe. So
yeah,
maybe some sort, and maybe it's not
Yes.
2D, maybe it's 3D.
Michelle says small bright spots.
Small bright spots, definitely. I see one up in the kind of 11 o'clock area and some along the edges.
we also have light from the edges too, as a comment in the chat box.
Excellent.
I see also a lot of variations of the color orange um, and a few of the color yellow.
Excellent. We're seeing different colors, variations in colors.
There seems like a dark, maybe black spot towards the top
Mhm.
of the circle.
Yeah, there's a lot of, we mentioned the light spots earlier, but there's maybe one little dark spot.
And then Michelle also notes there's a thin, darker partial ring in the bottom half.
Excellent. These are all great things to notice with this image. It's a very active image.
I think too, one thing that I guess I didn't realize right away, but now I'm noticing is that the the background surrounding this circle is completely black. It's completely dark. And so kind of the absence of color. Yeah.
Excellent. So we have some bright color in the middle, but then we have maybe absence of color back behind.
Mhm.
That's actually a really good segue to our next question, because I know that probably got everyone thinking a little bit about why is that? So the next question I have for everybody, when looking at this image and all the things you saw and noticed from the color and the texture and the light and the things coming off of it and the background, what does that make you think about? What are you thinking about when you look at this image? And these are things maybe that don't relate specifically to the things you're seeing in the image, but they can. So please share whatever you might be thinking about when looking at this image.
I think if I'm wearing my learner hat, I'm thinking about size. I think most students are always curious, the relative size of things like this. So I'm curious about that. And I'm probably also curious about extremes as a learner. And so I'm also probably a little curious about how bright this is in real life.
Yeah. So maybe there's brightness. Is this what it looks like in real life? And I like that what you're starting to think about, Ashley, is not just things that you're thinking about, but what you're wondering too. This is
Yeah.
something that I think is, which is fine. Like I said before, in the museum world especially, we sometimes kind of meld these strategies into the situation and how it works. And so thinking strategies are designed to help students learn the process of thinking, but it's okay once that process is starting to feel solidified to branch off and make it work for your different situations. So I love that you started wondering those things.
Michelle earlier said that it made her think about how awesome the sun was. And then we had a comment about it, the thinking about gassiness and solid. Like, is it, they have the idea that the sun is gassy, but it looks solid in the picture.
Excellent. It thought it was gassy, but maybe it's solid. Definitely we see texture there.
There's also a comment,
Definitely very
very
hot.
hot.
Yes, it is very hot. So these are great things to think about. And depending on how you're doing this activity, putting on your educator hat for a second, this might be a time to give a little bit of information about what you're looking at, because that can help spur on more curiosity when you get to your final question of the strategy. So this is an image of the sun. If you didn't introduce it that way, that can be exciting, because maybe people won't think it's the sun at first. Depending on what image you're looking at. We're looking at the sun in one color of light. And somebody noticed that there was brightness in the middle, but maybe there's variations on the sides, and that's because the sun is a big ball. So there's some of it that's closer to us and some of it that's curving away from us. And it is very hot. The part that we're looking at is over 15,000 degrees. It's super, super hot, and it can get hotter from there. So all of these things are things that while you were seeing and thinking about, you were able to see in the image itself. So after seeing this image and thinking a little bit more about it, what are some things that you wonder about the sun?
You know, I wonder, well, I guess I wonder how big it is.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's a great question.
I'm also curious how this picture was taken. So when I try to look at the sun, it hurts my eyes. When I try to
Yes,
take a picture of it with my, phone, doesn't do so well. So even just kind of how this image was produced, I think is a curiosity that I have.
absolutely.
Sharon also asks, how close can I get to it?
Ooh, excellent question. I've gotten that question many times. That is a great wondering.
Hmm. I'm wondering about Ashley was saying about the blackness
Mm,
behind, and
yeah,
I'm wondering about that, like what, why we see this big contrast and what that sort of represents.
excellent.
Oh,
So
Beverly has a great question that I never thought about before. Can it ever be destroyed? And that is such a right-on learner type question. I love
that
that.
is excellent. What a great wondering. Can it ever be destroyed? I mean, in this image, it's about as big as my hands, right? So
Yeah.
I'll pull it up.
Sharon also asks, why aren't flames shooting out all over?
Excellent wondering. These are
Yeah,
great
and why can't we see flames like we see them on the edge, but we don't really see them in
in the
the
front.
front of the image?
Absolutely.
And then is this the sun during nighttime? It doesn't look as yellow as during daytime.
Ooh, connecting it back to what you're normally experiencing is really important. Yeah, this doesn't look like our normal sun, though you shouldn't look at the sun normally. These are great wonderings, and I liked how a lot of them built up off of each other. This is one of the nice parts about doing this experience in groups or as a whole class, so that people can hear each other's experiences and might have wonderings because of what somebody else wondered. A lot of your wonderings too bridged so many different science topics, from how does this stuff work, from engineering and to like technological processes, the cameras that were used to take this image, and the way the telescope functions is a way that you could dig into about the engineering design process to try to capture these kinds of images. It's a really great area to think about. Some of the thoughts about scale and size and position are really important, especially for our learners who are early elementary, starting to think about these distances and sizes and our place in the universe. And looking at an image without its context can really start to help you think about those questions in a different way. We're used to seeing the sun as a little ball with lots of little lines of orbits around them. So it kind of reframes that question, helps people think about them differently. Also, the physics of the sun, even though those are topics that we don't normally get into in depth with terminology until later on in school, we can still explore the sun as being a hot ball of gas. And what does it mean for something to be hotter than fire? And how does that work? Just by looking at these kinds of images. When we see that texture on there, we're seeing the texture of a sun that is so hot it boils like a pot of water, which is something that a lot of people have experience with at home. I make a lot of tea right now, so I've been boiling a lot of water. So all of those different wonderings can stem a lot of different explorations. And all of these are in a kind of scientific exploration format. So we wanted to show you how this could work with a science object first, because it actually transfers so wonderfully across any object and topic. And hopefully we can start to see some potential connections with it, the ways we're thinking, and with the things that we're noticing. So thank you all for helping with that. This is another opportunity with the activity. I'll let Anne describe it.
Yeah, sometimes after you've looked at your object in a scientific way, in a different way, you might want to go back to your original image of the sun and think about, what does the sun look like now to you? And, would you create a different depiction of the sun, or would you change your depiction that you had before? Um, you know, uh, Related to the way that you think about it now. So you could take a minute right now if you have some materials and draw a picture of the sun, and what are the little details that we learned about the sun would you include in the picture that you drew, and how might you depict that?
I know if I were drawing it and I just drew a little bit of a sun here, I love including those little dots. It's not something I think about. When I draw the sun, I normally draw a big circle and I do a spiral in the middle because I like spirals. And then I draw like lines out. But this time I was like, oh, there's much smaller like little pieces and parts to it that I didn't think about before.
Mine is a little more wispy around the edges. You probably can't see it that well in my notebook, but it also has some of those little kind of flares too, just to kind of add a little bit of motion. So again, kind of building off of what Becca was saying, I think our initial depictions would probably have been kind of very simplistic and, a circle with maybe some lines, and maybe if you're really cool, you could have done like some triangle rays or that sort of thing. But beyond that, there you go.
Yep, exactly.
So we're also, I think, building too on some of our knowledge of kind of expanding from that simple notion of what the sun might look like to a much deeper understanding. That's great.
So the next few experiences, we've created our Learning Lab collection under kind of 3 categories of artworks associated with the sun to help you pick and choose with what you might be interested in talking about. So this first category is a little bit about the sun and the earth. So we chose a lot of really great artistic works from the Smithsonian's collections where the sun is represented in relationship with landscapes and nature. And so I know we just did our thinking strategy, and so let's practice it one more time at least all the way through here. We won't do it every single time in this session, but just to work that muscle that you just practiced. And we can go it a little quicker than we did last time too, and talk a little bit more about the meta experience happening here. So when we're looking at an image like this, especially if we're thinking about the image we just looked at, what do you see in this image?
So here I see, I see a lot of more kind of deeper reds in this image, but then I see a circle that has kind of a peachy, rosy color that's almost a little more muted than the rest of its surroundings too.
A lot of different colors. The landscape has a lot of different color, and this peachy circle, that's a different contrasted color than what the rest of the image is. Absolutely.
And the circle of the sun is partially behind a piece of the landscape. So you can think about whether that is showing the sun rising or setting. And oftentimes we know in the sunrise and sunset, there's different colors that we see in the landscape as well as on the sun itself that we can see. It's a time that we can see the sun as well. So it's sort of a special time.
Absolutely. You've brought up something that as we get to our thinking question, as we start to have learners experience this and start to think about what am I thinking when I look at this image, that's a big one with an image like this, is how is the sun positioned when we're looking at art? Sometimes we have art that is trying to imitate reality and sometimes we don't, and that's okay. But what does that mean for how I'm looking at the image? Does it mean I may be looking at something rising or setting? Does it mean the sun is literally on top of the earth? And how do I feel about that? And maybe why did the artist choose to represent it like that? Are all ways that you can kind of go through that thinking process just by starting with what you see and then thinking and wondering beyond that.
We have some great comments in the chat too, Becca, that I wanted to
Excellent.
bring up. So we have a comment, mountains like a Georgia O'Keeffe painting. So also making connections between some prior knowledge of art history. Michelle says very abstract representation of the land and earth. And let's see, it reminds me of a gorgeous sunset too. So also kind of personal connections and personal memories. And then the peachy circle seems to be a moon, and the dark red curve behind it is what might be the sun. So some interesting kind of speculations too based on the artwork as we start to look at it together.
This is great. Absolutely. I love that everyone was drawing on prior knowledge, and really uplifting that in participants can be useful because it'll solidify that they know art, one, and that their experience with art already will give them the ability to examine this. And I love the connections to Georgia O'Keeffe and abstraction, and even just thinking, is that a mountain? Are those mountains and things like that? This is a good time too with artworks often to hold back from giving the information that the artist either named, who the artist might be, what the description might be, because it lets the participant kind of dig in first with what their initial impressions are. This particular artwork is called Beyond the Hills at Sundown by Teo Danaki, and it's in our collection at the Museum of African Art here at the Smithsonian. And it's drawing on a lot of cultural inspiration. Adenaki is an Igbo woman painting with a lot of colors that are found in art and community there. And so there's a lot of meaning that can be drawn from the literal space and place where this artist is working that have inspired this kind of landscape with the sun. And so when all of the artworks that we've included in the Learning Lab that are around kind of nature are about kind of looking at how that interaction plays out between the sun and nature, and thinking about it scientifically too. Okay, we're at sundown. We can start to see maybe shadows. And what does that mean? We're starting to see the earth rotate on its axis and things like that. All things that our learners at this age are really starting to probe scientifically as well as emotionally. You want
Shall
to
we
go
look
to?
at the next one?
Yes.
Yeah, great.
So this image is, very different in tone from the previous image. So sometimes it's interesting to take a look at two different images. This is another topic that we thought about of the sun and people. So we have a number of artworks in the collection that show people doing different activities and in relating to the sun in different ways. So that might be a topic that would be interesting to explore with students and to think a little bit about how we relate with the sun and as opposed to the landscape relating to the sun. In this picture, again, we don't have to go through the whole process, but it's one of those things that you can start out and think about, what do you see at first? And what are the first things that you notice? And then, think a little bit about as you're looking from the top of the image and sort of make your way down to the middle and then towards the bottom of the image, and notice, what else do you notice? So where do you see the people are in the image?
Yeah, this image is really interesting because I can see the sun, but it's not the first thing I see. I see people first, and I see some symbols on some boxes, maybe. And that gets me thinking and wondering about a lot of stuff. I'm thinking I see there's like a big metal thing maybe in the front. Um,
Yeah, for
some
me, oh, go ahead.
please.
Oh, I was going to say for me, I noticed the water right away. And what's interesting about this is I feel like I also see the reflection of the sun in the water, which is something that we haven't talked about thus far with the first two images. So what I like about this image is it adds kind of that additional component of characteristics and indicators of the sun. And then I also see the sun in relation to the clouds too. So kind of more typical of what I might see on a normal sunny day. We also have some comments in the chat too. Soldier looking at the horizon and the sun's rays embrace hope. Shadows created by the sun. So some really good comments in the chat too about the things that people are seeing with this image.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
those are all such great comments, and I think that thinking a little bit about like, soldiers and how did you know they were soldiers, and sort of to beginning to think about that is one way that you could go with this. And clearly, this is depicting a particular time period and a particular point of view, but also the shadows, and thinking about, are these shadows realistic, and how do how do shadows fall with light, and then that gives you another scientific exploration to do with light and with the sun,
Absolutely.
which is a totally different way to go with the same image. So it's really interesting to think about all the different ways that you can use art and think about, a historical perspective or a scientific perspective or an artistic perspective.
I wanted to call out a few of the comments that have popped up about the light being stunning and the beginning of a new day, and things like that, and how emotional sometimes artworks can be when you're looking at it, and different types of emotions. And that can actually really ground a learning experience. Even if you eventually get into thinking about the image scientifically, that emotional connection to the image can create a really strong memory for learning. So it's another really big reason that really good way that art can function in learning is to create those kind of relevant or emotional connections with our learners. And we have a wondering in here. Right away, I wanted to figure out whether the sun was leaving or approaching. Is the sun rising? Is it setting? That's such a great wonder. And again, this is a good place to not tell the title because the title, right, is called Sinking Sun on Midway. So it gives you a little clue of what the artist was experiencing and thinking, which is a great line of discussion once that you reveal that. But hopefully there can be a lot of wonderings around kind of even the dynamics of what's happening in the painting. Always looking at the sun for a brand new day. Yeah, looking for how people connect to the sun. It's great. So we can go to our last category. I realize it's 4:15. I didn't realize this has been going so great. It's been going by quickly. So the last image that we have and the last category that we have is kind of the sun abstracted. And I want to make a note that we created that category as an education frame. This is not an art historical category necessarily, and it's not also what the artists themselves would have necessarily framed their works as. So I wanted to make that note. It is a note in the Learning Lab too, that as educators, I wanted to create kind of a way holistically to think about these different artworks. But here we have what might be the sun, and it is. I will tell you that it is supposed to be. But even using artworks that might not seem as realistic can still be a really strong way to connect both artistically and scientifically to the sun. One thing I wanted to point out specifically with this image is the colors that are used. So what do you notice about the colors here in this image?
I see a lot more blue.
Yeah.
You got a lot of blue. Excellent. So we've seen a lot of reds and yellows before. Here we see some blues, wondering why there's so many cool colors. Excellent.
They're in these vertical stripes, just different as well.
Maybe vertical stripes, definitely. So the reason I'm asking the question like this is as an example of how you can dig into something specific on an artwork too. And if you can have more general conversations or maybe something more specific, seeing a lot of different colors. And in this case, we're seeing a lot of different colors on a painting called Snoopy Early Sun Display. So this was a painting by the artist Alma Thomas, who was an African-American artist working here in Washington, D.C., actually, and was really inspired to paint by a lot of pieces around the sun and spacecraft and space because of the landing on the moon in 1969. And so that's there's a lot of reference in even the abstracted work about the sun. But one of my favorite parts scientifically here is that these are all colors that you can find in the sun. When we think about the sun scientifically, the sun looks like it's white light because all the colors are mixed together. But when you break all of those up, the entire spectrum, the whole rainbow exists inside of it. So using art to kind of probe these unknowns or things you might not readily notice can be really useful as well. So that's one of my reasons I really love this artwork when exploring the sun scientifically.
Should we go to the next image?
Yes,
All
I
right.
think so.
Yeah, now we've looked at the sun from just, thought about it in our own perspective. We've looked at the sun from a scientific perspective, and then we've looked at several different artworks depicting the sun. So we can then go back again to our question and like think about how we want to depict the sun and maybe create a new depiction of the sun. How would you then think about how you would want to depict the sun? Would you think about symbolic, things about the sun like the sunset or the sunrise and what the sun symbolizes to you and to people in your life? Or would you think more about what the sun does for us with power and energy? And then how would you show that in an artwork? And I think that this could be a great prompt for students to really dive into creating artworks that would be very meaningful to them, but also, would be really grounded in all of those different standards and all this in the science and in the artwork.
These are also great questions to ask when building scientific models. If you would prefer to have students build models instead, still asking, okay, what do you notice about what you did? And why do you think you added that or did that? Can really help them process what they created and how they created it. So the same principles apply both in art and in science.
And I love that. One of
Yeah, and
the comments in the chat was that they'd want to add additional dimension to their sun. So even thinking about how we started from that first image where it might have been more like Anne's with just a circle and some lines outside, and then we kind of grew our understanding and expanded our own knowledge base with the scientific images, and then now with these artistic images too, I feel like there's so much more that I could be able to kind of contribute to my sun drawing than I did earlier, even in this session. So that's great.
the other thing I'm not sure that we mentioned, I can't remember if we mentioned it, but the image of the sun that we showed you, the scientific image of the sun, is actually manipulated. It is a realistic image of the sun, but it was created, and Becca can tell you a little bit more about how that image was created, but it is, you know, it's in the service of science, an artistic image. So that's
Yeah.
another art science connection.
Absolutely. I think one of my favorite topics connecting art and science with the sun, and with celestial objects in general, is that every image you see is a processed image. And processing, when we think about it from an artistic standpoint, means fixing up and playing with and manipulating. But from a science perspective, it means taking data and processing it so that we can see that data in a different way. And so thinking about the same kind of idea in two different ways can help bridge that connection as well. And in the case of this image, if you were to look at the sun with your eyes, you are going to see something very different. Please don't do that. We have great tools to help you do it safely. Um, we never encourage people to look at the sun with your eyes, but if your eyes were super safe and could, you would see something very different. And that's because our eyes are made very differently than how cameras function. And cameras actually can enhance our vision. So and cameras and photography are another fantastic connection to how we do science, and how we do art.
It's a great segue to one of the comments in the chat was, would you use videos, for example, of the sun perhaps to kind of show the sun in motion, spitting out gases, all of those things. And so I'm curious, does the observatory that you work at, are there any videos that are captured? I know you showed us an image.
So in the Learning Lab, there's actually a few videos that we've included
Oh,
from not our observatory, but an observatory that's managed partly by the Smithsonian that's actually in space, the Solar
great.
Dynamics Observatory. And those videos are really cool. But again, a really great way, I think, adding dynamic elements to this, exploring scientific videos, and as well as dance and music. These kinds of questions can be used to probe those kinds of resources in the same way. There was a really great interpretive dance about the sun and stars that was at my local dance troupe, and there was a lot of explosions with arms and legs and things like that, and it was a really cool thing to watch. So again, really great connections that can be made with moving art and imagery and science as well. That's great.
Yeah, the Solar Dynamics Observatory, you can see images of what the sun looks like, pretty much like right now. So that's pretty amazing to see the changes and how it changes every day. So it's pretty awesome.
Excellent. So we have just about 5 minutes left. I just wanted to be mindful of the time. Feel free, as we're finishing up with our planned presentation, to use the chat box to ask questions of Becca and Anne. We want to make sure that we get to as many as possible. So whether it's from a learner hat or a teacher hat, feel free to ask questions in the chat box of our experts here, and then we'll finish out our presentation in just the next few minutes too.
Yeah, we only have, I think, one or two more slides. We just wanted to offer some potential extensions that could happen. And you can talk a little bit more about our early childhood extensions.
Yeah, I think, the sun is one object in nature, but there's lots of other objects in nature. So you can extend to think about the symbolic meaning or, the actual meaning different objects. It could be flowers or leaves or, of course, the moon, my favorite, and you know, using those same kinds of thinking strategies that we used for the sun to explore those with younger children.
And for our extension suggestions for older kids, thinking a little bit about how to bring literacy and writing as a skill and an art form into the process, either exploring the sun symbolism in their life as well as society, extending beyond themselves to think about how the sun interacts with their families or their communities or their friends, and writing things like a poem or a story or an essay, or just even finding symbols that use the sun in their own life. You'll see in the Learning Lab connection that we have some objects that have the sun on them, like raisin packets and stamps and things that you might not think about when you think about the sun, but that still include the sun, and kind of interrogating why that is can be part of the learning process. The title I see of that first painting that we looked at is Beyond the Hills at Sundown, and it's one of the first paintings in the Learning Lab collection.
Great.
Yeah, Becca and I just had so much fun getting ready for this webinar, and our brains were going in all sorts of different directions, and we were really enjoying it. So we hope that you enjoy it as well, and it gave you some food for thought. And if you have any questions for us, we'd love to hear from them.
Absolutely. Are there any questions about not just this webinar, but anything air and space related in general? We're happy to answer.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much. And I'll give some time for the chat. So if people have questions, please feel free. We have 3 more minutes at least. So for sure, the presenters are here to answer your questions. I wanted to mention too that during this time where most folks are they certainly are entrenched in distance learning. The Smithsonian also has a number of resources from the National Air and Space Museum, but also from across the Smithsonian in distance learning. And so I'll be sure to put the distance learning link into the chat, as well as the specific collection of resources that Becca and Anne have curated so generously for us. I love that you chose kind of 4 images to look at from that large selection too. So I'm just thinking of all the possibilities and ways that, depending on what your learning objectives are, you could really kind of pick and choose based on a kind of modular approach to some of these collection objects that you featured. So I really love that. And so we'll continue to look in the chat too. Go ahead.
The question about where the questions are, it's under the questions section, not the chat.
I'm sorry, I've been calling it the chat
Me
this
too.
entire time.
Me
I'm
too.
sorry.
And it helped me to expand the whole thing and open it up a little bit so I could see everybody's questions.
Excellent. And so one thing that I'll do right now, as we're still kind of finishing up, I'm going to show the Learning Lab collection just one more time so you can see it, so you can have a kind of an idea of what's available to you. And so again, just to kind of go through what they've curated for you is all of the kind of resources, the good key kind of meaty questions and activities to start with, as well as the thinking routines. And then you can see sectioned off, there are the artworks that have to do with the sun and the earth. This was our first artwork that we looked at. And then we had the sun and the people. And so again, here's that artwork that we had looked at as well. And as we continue to scroll down, we also see the sun abstracted, and actually there's a beautiful series from Alma Thomas that has been included in this section, but there's also some really fun artworks too. I think this is actually a quilt from the 19th century, and so you can really kind of see the breadth that's possible when taking one topic from multiple perspectives, especially in this collection. And then I wanted to point out too, there's several videos too, not only from the Air and Space Museum and the Solar Dynamics Observatory, but also from the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory. Lots of great videos that can also be included in this type of exploration with students. So I just wanted to point out that all of this is already done for you. The work has been done, it's been curated for you, and it's available for free as of right now. You can access this today and use it with your students tomorrow if you'd like. So I will make sure that the link is in the chat box for you, or excuse me, in the questions box for you so that you can see that as well. But just wanted to share that with you as well. As we close out, are there any kind of last thoughts, Anne or Becca, that you have?
I think that the biggest thing for me is just to, when I think of things, is, you know, to really ground things in the evidence and in what you see, and then going from there. That's where it's really, it can be really rich for helping the kids to develop their observational skills and grounding in evidence, which is really important in both art and in science.
Absolutely. And just to build on that, as somebody who works with lifelong learners and learners of all ages, those skills continue to need to be developed. And sorry, sirens in my neighborhood. And never, and that need to explore never goes away. And so just being able to ask simple questions and create space for those kinds of explorations can be really impactful to someone's learning experience. They've been impactful for mine too as a learner, and I've seen it be impactful for my learners as well.
Excellent, wonderful. Well, there's lots of thank yous in the chat. I hope you're seeing that. I also just added the links for folks that were asking about those, so hopefully you see that as well. But if you do not, let us know. Emily asked if they could be emailed, and this might be a perfect transition to bring Mary Reese back on from NJPSA.
Well, I thank you all, particularly our participants who've been so active throughout this past hour. It's just wonderful to see all the comments and questions that you've included. And certainly I have to thank Ashley for organizing this, but Anne and Becca too, for bringing to life for us all the work that you're doing at the Smithsonian, particularly about the sun. I want to remind everybody that, as Ashley said, these digital resources are available and the work's been done. You know, there are lessons and all sorts of suggestions, not just from the Air and Space Museum, but also from the other museums within the Smithsonian organization. So I want you to know this is being recorded and it will be emailed to you. And with that, you'll see the notes that have been listed in the questions as well, along with those links. So I think that should be able to satisfy your questions about how we can get access to the various materials that have been presented today. But once again, I'm thrilled with this collaboration that NJPSA and FEA has with the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital Access, and I hope we'll continue to do this work in the future. So I thank you all, and once again, I thank the participants for being so active and engaged with this webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
This is wonderful.